To order. Welcome to meeting number 40 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Accounts. Pursuant to Standing Order 108-3G, the committee is meeting today to undertake a study on Report 8, Emergency Management in First Nations Communities, Indigenous Services Canada of the 2022 reports 5 to 8 of the Auditor General of Canada, referred to the committee on Tuesday, November 15th. I would now like to welcome our witnesses. Office of the Auditor General, Karen Hogan, Auditor General of Canada, Glenn Wheeler, Principal, Doreen Devine, Director, Department of Indigenous Services, Gina Wilson, Deputy Minister, Valerie Gideon, Associate Deputy Minister, Joanne Wilkinson, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Regional Operations Sector by video conference, Kenza Ailbeed, Director General, Sector Operations Branch, Regional Operations Sector by video conference. Ms. Hogan, you have the floor for 5 minutes. We will then, yes, go ahead, please.
Madam Chair, thank you for this opportunity to discuss our report on emergency management in First Nations communities, which was tabled in the House of Commons on the 15th of November 2022. I would like to acknowledge that this hearing is taking place on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Joining me today are Glenn Wheeler and Doreen Devine, who led this audit. Emergencies such as floods and wildfires are happening more often and with greater intensity across Canada. These emergencies disproportionately affect many First Nations communities because of their relative remoteness and socioeconomic circumstances. Over the last 13 years, more than 1,300 emergencies have occurred in First Nations communities, causing more than 130,000 people to be evacuated and displaced. Echoing our 2013 audit in this area, we concluded that Indigenous Services Canada had not provided First Nations communities with the support they needed to manage natural emergencies. Over the last 4 years, the department has spent about $828 million on emergency management for First Nations communities. We found that the department's actions were more reactive than preventative. Although First Nations communities had identified many infrastructure projects to mitigate the impact of emergencies, the department had a backlog of 112 of these projects that it had approved but not funded. Indigenous Services Canada was spending 3.5 times more money on responding to and recovering from emergencies than on supporting communities to prepare for and mitigate the impacts. According to Public Safety Canada, for every dollar invested in preparedness and mitigation, $6 can be saved in emergency response and recovery costs.
Despite our 2013 recommendation, Indigenous Services Canada still had not identified which First Nations communities most needed support to increase their capacity to prepare for emergencies. If the department identified these communities, it could target investments accordingly. For example, building culverts and dikes to prevent seasonal floods would help minimize the impact on people and reduce the cost of responding to and recovering from emergencies. Until the department shifts its focus to prevention and invests in infrastructure, communities are likely to continue experiencing greater effects from emergencies. We also found that capacity needs of First Nations were not identified. For example, although the department provided funding to First Nations for about 190 full-time or part-time emergency management coordinators, it did not know how many more were needed for First Nations to have the capacity to manage emergencies. Since 2009, 268 communities have been evacuated, some more than once. While the majority of these evacuations lasted less than a month, 90 were more than 3 months long, and some lasted multiple years. One has been ongoing for over 10 years. Indigenous Services Canada did not ensure that emergency services were culturally appropriate and comparable to services provided in municipalities of similar size and circumstances. The department did not define comparable services. It also did not consistently monitor the services provided to First Nations communities by provinces and other service providers. In 2011, at the end of her mandate as Auditor General of Canada, Sheila Fraser summed up her impression of the government's actions after 10 years of audits and related recommendations on First Nations issues with the word unacceptable. 5 years later, my predecessor, Michael Ferguson, used the words beyond unacceptable. We are now into decades of audits of programs and government commitments that have repeatedly failed to effectively serve Canada's Indigenous peoples. It is clear to me that strong words are not driving change. Concrete actions are needed to address these long-standing issues, and government needs to be held accountable. Madam Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We are pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now go to Ms. Wilson for 5 minutes.
Kwe kakina, hello, ulukut, tanse, bonjour. Thank you for having me. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are on the land of my ancestors, my relatives, and we gather in the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Miigwech, thank you for inviting me to appear, and the team here with me before the House Standing Committee on Public Accounts. I am grateful to the committee for taking an in-depth look at the report of the Auditor General of Canada, Managing Emergencies in First Nation Communities. I'd like to thank the Auditor General and the staff for this detailed report. We agree with the 7 recommendations in the report, and Indigenous Services Canada is committed to acting on each recommendation with a detailed plan. The work we are doing with First Nation partners to address the critical gaps that exist in emergency management, in fact, closely aligns with the recommendations outlined in the Auditor General's report and includes a comprehensive action plan. Nos travaux sont guidés par deux.
Our work is guided by 2 key principles. First Nations must have input into their own emergency management planning and response. And they must be full and equal partners in decisions that affect their own communities. Our shared focus is prevention. We are developing emergency management plans and multilateral service agreements with First Nations that clearly establish the protocols, roles, responsibilities, and funding for the various partners within emergency management governance structures.
Example is the Tripartite Memorandum of Understanding on Emergency Management that we signed in 2019 with British Columbia, the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations, the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, and the First Nations Summit. This Memorandum of Understanding has proven to be effective, and in February 2022, Indigenous Services Canada approved an additional $5.7 million for the 22-23 fiscal year to the First Nations Emergency Services Society through the Emergency Management Assistance Program. We've also been making significant investments in infrastructure to mitigate the impact of emergencies in First Nation communities. Since 2016, and as of June 30th, 2022, ISC has invested $121.1 million, excluding operating expenses, to support 103 structural mitigation projects, 50 of which are now complete. These projects will benefit 107 communities, serving approximately 116,000 people. ISC has also invested in additional First Nation emergency management coordinators across Canada who help communities prepare for and respond to emergency events in a culturally relevant manner. Regarding our support role in emergency preparations and response, I'd like to highlight our work with First Nations and partners regarding potential flooding along the James Bay and Hudson Bay coasts, including Kasheshuan First Nation. Since 2016, ISCA supported an annual precautionary evacuation of Kasheshuan First Nation, and since 2020, we've supported Kasheshuan and Fort Albany First Nations on the Land Initiative, where residents can temporarily move to higher ground onto their traditional lands. Another recent example is Hurricane Fiona in September. First Nation chiefs and leaders in the Atlantic region played a key role in assessing the immediate needs of citizens and determining the assistance needed, and we're already preparing in advance of the storm. Their dedication ensured the health and safety of affected communities. De plus, service au...
Moreover, Indigenous Services Canada has mobilized an emergency management team and stayed in active communication with all parties involved, resulting in a coordinated and appropriate response and assistance. We have continued to work closely with the communities to develop and provide recovery support and assistance. Overall, our continued priority is to ensure the health, safety, and well-being of First Nations and address the gaps that exist in emergency management. I would like to thank all our partners for working with us.
The committee for inviting us here today. So, Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. I'd like to welcome Mr. Vidal and Mr. Gahir to committee today. We are now ready to begin our first round for 6 minutes. Mr. Vidal.
It's Mr. McCauley.
Oh, Mr. McCauley?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. Thanks for filling in as chair. A.G. Hogan, thanks for this report. I didn't think it could get worse than the Veterans Affairs report, but here you go. I want to start with the AG's comments, both past, present, and past. Sheila Fraser, after 10 years of audits and ignored recommendations, in 2011 said the results were unacceptable. Mr. Ferguson follows up 5 years later and says it's beyond unacceptable. And then the current AG says, we're now into decades of audits and commitments that have repeatedly failed to serve Canada's Indigenous people. I've got the 2013 report here. Every single recommendation was agreed upon by Indigenous Affairs, as called at the time. So we have audit after audit, recommendation after recommendation is blown off by the department. Decades of failure to serve our Indigenous people, yet the department repeatedly just says, we agree to recommendations. So I have two questions, and I'm going to be very blunt here. Why should anyone in this committee, the Auditor General, anyone in Canada, believes Indigenous Services when they say, yes, we agree, we're going to act on it? And as a follow-up question, why should I or anyone else in this room as an MP not immediately head up to the House, stand in the gallery and demand that every manager involved in this file be immediately terminated for this absolute, abject, and seemingly willful negligence? This is low-hanging fruit and decades of failure. And again, agreed. How do we get past this, and why should we not be calling for everyone's dismissal attached to these horrific results?
Is there a question there, sir?
I had two questions. Why should we believe Indigenous Services when you say you agree to these, when departments agreed in the past and have done nothing? And again, why should we not be in the House of Commons demanding dismissal and termination for everyone involved in this negligence, this seemingly purposeful, willful negligence of this file?
Okay, and I believe that's directed at me, Madam Chair, so I will make an attempt to respond to that. So I would take some exception to the words having blown off those recommendations or that we have completely ignored them. As Deputy Head and Primary Accounting Officer, I would say that we've managed all of our programs well. Our terms and conditions set out by Treasury Board with balanced budgets Can we do better? Yes. And the Auditor General has given us 7 recommendations that help us move us forward, and I thank her for that.
And I appreciate that, and I know you say what you kind of have to say, but this is like 3 audits in a row. Like just damning where the department says, yes, we agreed, and then go off to their way and not deliver on what they agreed upon. Like, what are the consequences for the last 9 years since the last report for the bureaucrats and the management involved on this file for this failure? And I'm going to disagree with you. I don't believe there have been, I don't think any way you can look at this and say, yes, we've accomplished a lot, or yes, we're serving the people.
And Madam Chair, I am hoping through this particular meeting that we can demonstrate that we have in fact made progress through our deliberations and the responses that we'll give. We will hope to prove to you differently that in fact we are managing this as best we can at this point in time. Okay. Madam Chair.
Last year, 95% of executive level and above management in Indigenous services received bonuses totaling $3.3 million. Do you believe that it's warranted to be rewarding what I'm going to repeat as such abject failure?
Performance bonuses is not in my realm to talk about, Madam Chair. I would leave that to Treasury Board and others who make those decisions. That is beyond my decision. Thank you.
I'm going to answer that for you. I think the answer is no. We're spending more, and it has been identified repeatedly, we're spending more on recovery than being proactive. Like, who's making the decision to prioritize reactive rather than proactive in the mitigation? Whose decision is that?
So I agree, actually, that we need to shift that from response. I agree that we need to make this shift in Canada more broadly and in the First Nation emergency management world. And I want us all to put our attention, our focus, our efforts towards mitigation and preparedness.
Whose decision would it be to do that? It seems like a no-brainer. It's been identified. Who needs to say, this is what we're doing?
I don't think actually this concept of communities and countries and municipalities, all parties actually wanting to move increasingly towards mitigation and preparedness is not a new concept. Certainly not.
Right. But please, I'm looking for an answer. Who needs to make this decision to say focus on the mitigation and not the cleanup? It's been identified in this report there's some nations, like for 10 years now, we've been going through this.
All jurisdictions need to make that particular recommendation. All
so your department has no say in that.
We have a say in that, and all emergency management experts, in fact, do repeat that message that we need to be focusing more on mitigation and preparedness.
Okay. What is it going to take to get your department to focus on that?
We are
A short answer, please.
We are definitely working towards that shift, sir.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. We now move on to Ms. Bradford for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today for this very, very important report. My first few questions I think I'm going to address to the Auditor General. I'm looking at page 8 of the report, specifically the graph that looks at the greatest unmet structural mitigation needs. And it indicates that they were in British Columbia and Alberta by a long shot when you look at it. In the case of BC, it seems to be eligible but unfunded that jumps out at you. And in the case of Alberta, they're unreviewed projects that haven't been reviewed. Do you know why this is? Why there's such a discrepancy between the situation in BC and Alberta versus the rest of the country?
Madam Chair, it's a question I would suggest that you actually ask the department. You have the luxury of having the Deputy Minister here, and she would be better placed to answer that.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much then. So I will address that to you if you don't mind. And I know that this is obviously an issue that's of personal concern to you. So I would like to know what you feel about that.
And that's my turn now, right?
Yes,
okay.
Yes, it is. It's
Thank
your
you.
turn. Thank you.
Okay, so on those particular projects, and I can't speak to the regional variations that exist, but I would say, as a starting point, I think we would certainly want to be funding, and we'd prefer to be funding all 112 of these projects. And I'll explain this with some context, if I may. This department has a finite amount of resources that are appropriated each year. There are 112, and I think we're actually down to about 96, 94 unfunded mitigation projects. There are also thousands of unfunded infrastructure projects at large across First Nation communities in Canada. I don't think this is something we do not know. Everything from school renovations where kids can learn, water projects that lead to the lifting of drinking water advisories, and I'm not even going to get into housing and homelessness. And so these are the choices that this department, with its First Nation partners, end up making, is what do we fund this year? What do we fund now? What do we fund next month? The announcement that was made yesterday was actually quite hopeful for me. This was Canada's National Adaptation Strategy to protect communities and build a strong economy. I connected, for instance, with the Infrastructure Deputy Minister today, and they confirmed that, yes, for Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund, Indigenous recipients are eligible, and they'll fund 100% of eligible expenses for their projects. So we're going to be working closely now with Environment Canada and Infrastructure to try to get more projects funded. Thank you.
Okay, so according to the report recommendation 8.36, the department should address the backlog of eligible but not yet funded structural mitigation projects, and that of structural mitigation projects that have not been reviewed, like I was mentioning before, in order to allocate the resources effectively and reduce the impact of emergencies on First Nations communities. It seems the same ones get hit over and over again. So what can the department do without additional funding? Are there things that you could do that don't necessarily involve additional funding?
Sure. It's a great question. What can the department do? We ask ourselves that question quite a lot, and then we ask ourselves, are we making that decision unilaterally, or are we making that decision with First Nations? Certainly when it comes to infrastructure funding, we try to work as closely as possible in partnership with those First Nations and determine priorities collectively. Sometimes those priorities the mitigation priorities don't move up quickly enough. Perhaps the community is looking for housing before they're looking to clear up this eroding shoreline. So those choices come down to very difficult ones for both the department and the community. But I appreciate
I want to make sure I get this in. So from 2018 to 19 to 2021-22, 13 First Nation communities were evacuated at least 3 times. 4 of the 13 had not applied for funding for non-structural preparedness and mitigation activities. So why did some of the most heavily affected communities not apply for funding?
I'm going to refer to Joanne probably on that one, or Kenza, to speak directly to those particular communities. Over to you.
Okay,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you for the question. I would say that we are increasingly reaching out proactively to nations who are not those who have the capacity or have had the capacity in the past to put those types of proposals together. We've tried to lighten the burden for nations in terms of those application processes. And as the deputy mentioned, really work in partnership with them so that we are at the table together with the nation, with the province, with ourselves, and federal partners throughout the system to bring those solutions forward in a way that does not burden them on the application process. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. There is 6 seconds left.
Oh, okay, so no, can't do it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, and now we move to Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You're doing very well. And thanks as well to my colleague Kelly for his provisions today, which are doing us so much good. I think we've heard an interesting introduction from my Conservative colleague on the devastating effect of having to read that after 3 reports put out by the Auditor General, the Office of the Auditor General, we find that there is no or very little improvement. Despite prior recommendations and these recommendations having been accepted, we see now that absolutely nothing was done. And when we say that absolutely nothing was done, we see that there are the same problems. Yes, of course, perhaps some projects occurred. We wouldn't be able to say the contrary, but they're insufficient. Despite everything, despite all the observations made, we're still mitigating. We're still just reacting rather than preventing. And that's a real problem, especially given that we're aware that climate change is moving ahead at great paces, that we'll get more fires, more floods, all these problems. We know there'll be more and more of them. However, we're still merely reacting, despite all the recommendations that have been made to this effect. So I would like to ask the department, or rather to Indigenous Services Canada, knowing that no one here denies the existence of climate change, and we all know it's only going to get worse, are you able to at last move into prevention on reserve, or will you continue merely to react to emergencies, which will cost us 6 times more? We are increasing mitigation, but I will allow my colleague to respond. Thank you for the question. I would say that we're in a transition period. Of course, we are also calling for funding that would allow us to be able to respond to all the needs that have been identified. Right now, the program has, in the past at least, been structured to respond to emergencies. So we do have emergency response capacity. We also have the ability to call for funding on a yearly basis in response to the needs to reimburse based on the strategies in place. But provinces and territories really have a responsibility to work on mitigation with us. We must work with them and also involve First Nations partners. So we do need to work on goodwill basis with the provinces and territories. We depend on their involvement to be able to ensure that we transition correctly to prevention. The department has signed agreements on emergency management services in 6 provinces. What about the rest? We're discussing these matters with all provinces and territories. It's important to know that even in the provinces we're on a good basis with, there are no actual agreements. However, we work very, very closely with you when there are emergencies. Let's say Fiona, the hurricane. There was a great deal of work with the First Nations partners as well as the provinces, even if we don't have bilateral agreements with each and every one of them. So we hear about this collaboration, but in the reports we see that absolutely nothing is getting any better. So it's all lovely to talk about cooperation, but these agreements should have been signed a long time ago. In an emergency, yes, of course, people move quickly, but why weren't they signed already? Perhaps you could tell us that. Well, of course, we also depend on the level of priority given to these issues by the provinces and territories and our other partners. We also need to keep in mind that there's been a quick rise recently in the number of emergencies that all of us are facing on a yearly basis, and also on how widespread they are across the entire country. So when it comes to working together, I understand that that only happens in states of emergency. But we know that these things will only get worse and worse. So I'll go back to my first question. Knowing that these things will only get worse, wouldn't it be smart to have agreements finally signed with each of the provinces in order to be able to prevent the worst rather than merely respond to it? We agree with you. We also give priority to our agreements with our First Nations partners, not only with the territories and provinces. Okay, with First Nations partners, we agree that finally people are approaching this matter differently. We're getting out of the old British colonial mode at last. But I do understand that First Nations must, of course, be consulted. They should be more than consulted. We should invest in capacity building. And that as well was brought up by the Auditor General. They need to be able to identify their needs, but also receive training. Is all that taken care of? We do have a budget to build capacity in communities in this way. It's not that big a budget, but with that funding, we have been able to fund some coordinators, the emergency management coordinators in the communities, as well as in First Nations agencies around the country. We have 176 of them now, and we hope to be able to add to that group. My time is over, I think.
Okay. We now move to Mr. Desjardins for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. You're doing a great job. I want to start by recognizing how tremendously difficult this is for me and for many members across Canada as they continue to witness the increase in very violent storms, very violent wildfires, and very violent floods. When I was first elected, it was on the premise that I would be able to do less harm in this place, that Indigenous people's contribution in this place could in fact help to reduce harm in our communities. The fact that this report echoes work, I should say failures, over decades is something I'm ashamed of, something that all Canadians are feeling ashamed of right now too. It's deplorable to know that in our country, this is the reality still facing Indigenous people. Right now, I had the unfortunate time to actually respond to an emergency disaster in Northwest Alberta in 2019, the Chuckegg wildfires. We've seen the provincial government try their best to react. We've seen Indigenous communities try their best to react. We lost 16 homes, and the Indigenous community had to take that cost. Canada still to date has contributed nothing. I want to get to the bottom of who is responsible. I echo the Auditor General's comments in asking for accountability. This is deplorable. I'm short of outraged. And if it wasn't Friday, I'd probably have more energy to yell about this, but the reality is there's no words I can use to replace the difficulty that Indigenous people I met with during these wildfires, during these floods, that I can in any way, shape, or form reproduce here. I can only plea with the Deputy Minister that she take her responsibility more seriously and know that we cannot see another report like this in a decade. It's unacceptable that the public service has known about these failures for decades. And as Mr. Macaulay mentioned, they sit on shelves. Indigenous people are told, we accept these. We're going to be partners. When I had the Deputy Minister here about a year ago talking about clean water issues, which are still prevalent, it was supposed to be done years ago. She's no longer the Deputy Minister, I recognize. You're now the Deputy Minister. And there's real cost to inaction. Real people are going to be hurt without actually doing this. So I need the Deputy Minister to be as forthcoming and as honest with Canadians as possible so that we know as parliamentarians, duly elected members of this country, how to actually fix this. Because shielding and defending the government right now is not going to work. We cannot, in this committee, tolerate continued defense of a government that will not act on this. And Madam Chair, I'm sorry how angry I am about this. But I know you understand as well. You've been in this committee long enough to know how deeply disturbing this is. I need to know who's at fault. I need to know who to hold accountable. And if it's not the Deputy Minister, then you need to tell us who. Because we need answers, and we've been waiting 2 decades. Who is responsible for these failures? Canadians are losing faith in this system. I don't have faith in Indigenous Services Canada. Canadians don't have faith in Indigenous Service Canada. The only one who seems to have faith in Indigenous Service Canada isn't even the Auditor General. It isn't even members of the Indigenous Service from your statement this morning. I need to know where the problems are so we can fix this. First of all, we need to have a system that actually is accountable. So I need to understand what accountability measures are also important in this discussion. Who is accountable to the Deputy Minister? Who is at fault for the continued failure of this audit? Why is it that Indigenous communities continue to face the same failures in their community for support? Who is responsible?
So I believe that's a question to me, Madam Chair. Before I get into that, I just want to ask for clarification, maybe offline, which community you're referring to about non-reimbursement. Happy to follow up on that. And completely agree with you that as Indigenous peoples working around this table, we are here to reduce harm to Indigenous peoples. I believe we're all committed to that. You want me to be very honest and very clear about where the responsibility lies. I would say it is all of us. And I say that only in great respect, but the department does not.
I don't know if I could take that as an answer. We need to actually have action items here on this.
So
if you hear more, I spoke to the Deputy Minister in the past, and she gave me the same response that you're giving me now. It's all of us. It's about partnership with Indigenous people. Indigenous people need to be the ones to have the onus on them. It's Indigenous people who need to come to the government. It's someone else other than me. Someone has to take accountability for this. I'm tired of coming here asking the same question. Like, it's like I'm talking to a wall or a room of nothing. Like, who is responsible? I know the Deputy Minister, I know the Auditor General made comments to us that I can't directly cite in this meeting along the lines in relation to the involvement of politics in this system. I know from working in governments in the past and on behalf of Indigenous treaty governments as well that the political short-sightedness of the government comes at the cost of the long-term stability of First Nations. That is an issue, and it's something that the ministry has never, Indigenous Services Canada, Crown Indigenous Relations has never mentioned. Although we know this to be the issue, we need the deputy ministers to act on behalf of Canadians and to demonstrate where the accountability is going wrong. We need to have tangible, concrete answers. Who is responsible? Is it the minister? Yes or no?
Mr. Desjardins, you'll have to hear the answer in the next round. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll continue with my response. So I was going to say a lot of this.
Ms. Wilson will hear the answer in the next round. We will now begin the second round for 5 minutes, starting with Mr. Vidal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the committee for having me here, and thank you to our guests for being here. The colleagues previous, started with Mr. McCauley, all through my colleagues here have made it very clear the frustration and the concern that is at the table, and I'm going to start with the Auditor General. So, you know, in your report and in your opening comments, you talk about I'm being frustrated that almost a decade later, and we go on, this discussion is obvious, right? I would like to frame this in the context of this frustration should go way beyond the Ottawa bubble, beyond the people sitting at this table. As somebody that represents a riding in northern Saskatchewan that is home to the second largest population of Indigenous people in our country, this is very personal. And frankly, this is not about the frustration in the Ottawa bubble. It's about the frustration for people in these communities whose lives are being affected, their quality of lives are being affected. And it's not just in northern Saskatchewan, it's across this country. And so with that context, I've got a couple questions. And rather than kind of beat the dead horse that's maybe been kind of talked about a little bit, I want to come out of a little bit different approach. So to you, Auditor General Hogan, you very clearly said the time has come for action, for concrete action. If you could suggest one, out of your recommendations or something, what's the one concrete action that you would suggest that would have the biggest impact on preventing us from being here again in 10 years?
If I could figure out a way to package all 7 in one concrete action,
I'm only
I would
giving
do
you
that
one
for you, but I can't. So I honestly think it needs to start with an acknowledgement that it's time for all levels of government to invest in preparedness. The things that we just don't see needs to be done. For that to be done properly, Indigenous Services Canada needs to have a handle on the magnitude. So we talk about identifying the communities most at risk, so some that historically might have experienced natural disasters more often. But you also need to understand the magnitude, right? So every community needs to be included and considered. And until you have, I think, the lay of the land to know how much funding might be needed, how much capacity might be needed, you won't know how much you need to invest in that preparedness side.
Thank you. And sorry, I don't mean to be rude and cut you off, but they give me just such a limited amount of time. Thank you for that. So that all goes around this lack of a risk-based approach to this and all the way through to the proposal-based approach. And it's such a flawed model of how we do this. So I thank you for that. It seems to me, and this is more of a statement than a question maybe, that the people that are accessing the funding to solve their issues from a mitigation perspective are the people that best play the bureaucratic game, that find their way through this proposal-based system. When if we're not out doing the actual risk-based assessment to find out the areas that we need to invest in to be proactive and preventative, we're going to keep coming back to this spot. So I'm going to move on because I know I'm limited in time. Last week in the House of Commons, the minister, in responding to your report and in an answer to a question from my colleague, said, and I quote, "The Auditor General report noted that while Indigenous Services Canada is doing a great job helping emergency management of those crises, we need to invest more in protection and adaptation." I have two quick questions on that. One, I've scoured the report. I don't find anywhere where you state that Indigenous Services Canada is doing a great job in there. And I did some word searches and I did some digging. Is there somewhere another report or an appendix or something that these people get that we don't get? Or do you agree that they're doing a great job here somewhere that I missed?
So this is the only report that we have out there, so it's not like you've missed it. What we found about their response to emergencies, so I agree that they are responding to emergencies and helping communities recover from them.
But in fairness, would you also agree that their responses, when I go look at the responses in the report, I'm not sure this is a real word, but it's bureaucraties. It's like fluffy stuff about we're going to do this and we're going to support this and we're going to engage in this. But there's nothing concrete. There's nothing says we're going to go do this that will make a difference on the ground next week.
Which is exactly why in my opening remarks I said no combination of strong words or soft words is driving change. It is concrete action that is needed now. And I do encourage the department to come up with a more comprehensive action plan that's more fulsome so that action can be taken. Who needs to do what, when, and by when needs to be really clear for action to happen.
That sounds like measurable outcomes to me. In your report on page 19, you talk about spending is not a good measure because it does not mean that results are being achieved. Without better performance indicators, the department could not assess progress in achieving the sustainable development. Now, this wasn't specific to the sustainable development, some targets there, but I think that flows across the spectrum. That there's this old saying that says what gets measured gets done. And I mean, if we have a target and we're aiming for something, at least we know what we're achieving. Would you agree?
I would agree with you.
Short answer, please.
Absolutely, and I find that I have that comment often, that the government is excellent at measuring outputs, but not at measuring outcomes, and that needs to be fixed.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we move on to Mr. Dong for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to welcome the Deputy and the team and also the Auditor General for coming and talk about this very, very difficult topic. And of course, we already heard very passionate remarks from the member from the NDP, and I know it really struck my heart. You know, we know that this has been part of frustration has been going on for so many years. Through, the Auditor General just talked about 3 AGs or 2 AGs before her, and it is very frustrating. So I wonder. So it's not government or liberal government or conservative government. It's becoming a habit at the ministry. And how do we change this culture? And to start with this committee, to start with this meeting, that's the question I'm asking myself. And when I look at these numbers and the findings, I was looking for a key area where, how important it is to have the First Nation community to directly engage, and I think that's very important, and even leading, the management of emergency or mitigation in their jurisdiction. Can the deputy talk a little bit about that? Like, have that been seen as a priority in your department?
Thank you very much for the question, and I appreciate that comment, because we try to strive towards consistently working with First Nations in all matters relevant to them. Sometimes that's a little harder to do. Sometimes that takes more time, but it is so worth it because in the end, the outcomes are better. And so on this front as well, in the emergency management area, we actively pursue the establishment of negotiations and agreements. If a community calls us and wants to talk about emergency management, we are there. We're not ignoring, we're not completely turning them around. We're actually reaching out to provinces, territories, anyone who wants to work with us on emergency management.
Okay, so hold on there but there are still 112 unfunded projects, right? So I'm very happy to hear that you are proactively reaching out to communities, but we got to do it better. We got to show more willingness to work with them. And you mentioned about the province. And can you talk about a little bit about the multilateral cooperation between the federal government, provincial government, First Nations? Can you give us some example in the past? Like, tell us, try to convince us that things are happening and things are improving. Because by the finding of the AG, I'm just not convinced it is. We are turning the direction.
Thank you so much. When there is not a piece of paper that outlines a final agreement, ISC will still work with all the parties and provide funding to many of the jurisdictions. As I said, actively seeking partners, and we do find small wins. When a First Nation coordinator in my home community, for instance, my friend Celine Brazo, manages the pandemic for the community in such a way that keeps people safe, that to me is a win. When we reach out all days and hours, 24/7, talking to every community in the Atlantic during, before, and after Fiona, and we get sharing of information, for me, that's a win. Should we do more? The answer is absolutely yes.
So, currently any trilateral agreements signed to your knowledge?
So we have, as I mentioned, the agreement in British Columbia, which is complex because there are many First Nations in British Columbia, but it took the active driving push of the province, First Nation organizations, and the federal government to make that happen. We have bilateral agreements with many provinces and territories as well: British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, Prince Edward Island, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. We need to move those and shift those more towards multilateral agreements.
And what did you learn? Thank you.
Ms. Wilson. And we now move to Ms. St. Clair Desgainés for 2.5 minutes.
Merci,
Thank you, Madam Chair. To get back to, or rather to follow up onto what my dear colleagues have been delving into, I think we've reached the point where it seems to have been confirmed that the recommendations will be accepted. The intentions, people's will at least is good, but we need a timeline. You must be able to tell this committee, to tell us as elected representatives of the people, to tell us that we will solve this problem in the years to come. Meaning what? 3 years? 5 years? How much time do you think you need to finally be able to fund the projects that are necessary to ensure the well-being of First Nations peoples? We will return to the committee and provide reports.
Does not set its own budget. Parliament does that. I would like your support to ensure more resources to First Nations for emergency management going forward. If parliamentarians were to approve increased resources to the department, we will be happy to administer them.
Donc, là, j'ai des chiffres devant.
So I have figures here. Their spending was $16 billion for 2021-22. $39.6 billion is the main estimates for that year. So That's about double. So it seems there is a budget there for you. So could we get a timeline about how you're going to spend it? Higher funding also includes funding that was put aside to solve some court issues, very large amounts. So that funding is not solely for service delivery. Also, we need to have funding that's directly linked to the specific program. We don't get a global amount that we can use for anything with no conditions imposed. Of course, that is what the Deputy Minister is pointing out. We need funding specifically earmarked for responding to the recommendations of this report. All right, so the 17 billion extra in the main estimates for 2022-23 are for, yes, it also includes a number of elements, including agreements, many things that are being funded there, budgeted for. All right, if you look at the estimates for prevention, what with the voted credits, that's 12 billion. It would take 24 years for the
Thank you. And moving on to Mr. Desjardins for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I want to return to the question of accountability. I think it's an important one, and I think it's probably the most critical question of our time in relation to how Canadians actually understand settler Indigenous relations. When Canadians come together and expect their ministry to work, they pay taxes, they do everything right, but the systems keep failing them. Not just Indigenous people, but Canadians. They want to be allies, many of them, with Indigenous peoples. But the institutions they entrust to do this are failing. And I want to know exactly how to hold accountable your ministry in the continued violence against Indigenous people like we're seeing here. Is it money? Is it the minister? Is it the department itself? We hear from scholars oftentimes in committee about the structure of this place and how the structures of this place are inappropriate to be dealing with Indigenous people. It puts the onus on Indigenous people. You want partnerships rather than accountability. You want the Indigenous people to be in line, in a queue, rather than directly met through their treaty and non-treaty obligations. These are real systemic problems. Indigenous Service Canada is an old ministry. It's one that helped to administer, back when it was amalgamated with INAC, some of the most terrible and egregious systems in this country. And Canadians are expected to trust this system to deliver these results? No, they shouldn't have to be. That's why, as a government, they should be listening to how we can actually create structures that actually can be more accountable. Because I'm determined now that the fact that we're going to continue to see, after many audits, 3 Auditor Generals, the continued failures at ISC. I really do believe that there's a situation, not necessary to the system, not necessary to the people operating the system, but the system itself is broken. No matter who leads the department, it'll continue to have these results. My question is simple, and I'll return to it again. Who is responsible for these actions within the jurisdiction of the federal government, beyond platitudes of partnerships? I want to know who is responsible.
You asked before who is responsible, and I was going to continue with a response that I now have the chance to do. And I thank you for that, because I do want to, again, say, and I know you don't want to hear it, but we are all responsible to an extent. And it is money. It is money, but it's not only money. I would say if you as a committee want to hold us accountable, ask us to come back and provide you with a comprehensive action plan. Ask us to come back and demonstrate to you.
Can you provide that in writing, the comprehensive action plan, to this committee, please?
We are actually on going to be doing that through this, right, Clerk? Is that the idea? Chair? Yeah, preliminary, but we're supposed to come back with a detailed action plan.
It was sent to the members, the action plan.
We have the action plan. But not.
That's a preliminary. We had 1 week to turn that around, so we actually have a little more time to provide a detailed
Yeah,
one.
I would agree with Mr. McCauley. There was 20 years the department had to provide a more comprehensive response.
Thank you. And we now have to move on to Mr. Cram for 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. It's certainly a very emotional meeting, but I'd like us to maybe get into some of the specifics. I guess most of my questions will be for Ms. Wilson, but if Ms. Hogan or any of the other witnesses wish to intervene, certainly feel free to do so. So on page 18 of the report, it highlights the case of the Kashechewan First Nation in Northern Ontario. And this First Nation has been evacuated every year for the past decade. And they used to be evacuated to Thunder Bay and to other faraway communities. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, they were evacuated to higher ground within the reserve. So I'm wondering, now that the pandemic is over, will this First Nation continue to be evacuated to higher ground within the reserve, or will they continue to be evacuated to Thunder Bay and to other faraway places?
So I would think that if plans are not already in place, we wouldn't make that decision on our own, but certainly I'd ask Joanne maybe to talk to the current status of discussions with Kashechewan.
Certainly. Thank you very much for the question. And I would say the On the Land initiative for Kashechewan was certainly COVID was a factor, but it was not the only factor. The nation's leadership and community members were very interested in both from a cultural perspective, doing that on the land piece, but getting back to some of the previous questions, it is a more cost-effective way beyond how fantastic it has been from a cultural and safety perspective. The numbers there that we've seen are now about $140 per person a day for that On the Land initiative versus $235 a day when they were evacuated to host communities like Thunder Bay. That's a tangible piece that we are then able to then redirect and as folks have said, to move that towards prevention as opposed to continuing down the recovery path. And I'll just note that, there were questions earlier about previous audits. So after the 2013 audit, before that, it was very much an only recovery-based program, the emergency management program. That 2013 audit sparked a discussion around the 4 pillars of emergency management. And so this is how we've been able to do these types of projects with nations like Kashechewan, where they are at risk. They are at risk every year, and looking to find ways beyond diking, because there is a dike there, but it creates within the community kind of a dust bowl effect, right? So working with the community, working with the province to make sure that we're finding ways where people can be safe, but can also explore that cultural piece so that it is not just about an evacuation, but also building on other pieces that are important to the community. Thank you.
So just doing some quick math on that one. So there were 1,825 band members, and instead of spending $235 per day, it will now only cost $140 per day. And given that it's a 6-week evacuation, that means the cost goes from about $18 million down to $10 million. So my next question is, what happens to that $8 million that gets freed up? Will it be used for prevention or a permanent solution, or what happens to the freed up $8 million?
I think that's the direction we're going in, Joanne. I think you referred to being able to redirect those resources to prevention.
Yes, so the way the budget works is that we don't receive kind of a massive amount of money to start. Our A-based funding is smaller than that, and we go and seek funding to supplement based on actual costs. But absolutely, as we're able to build that case study around the significant reduction in costs, we would look to go back and have discussions, as the deputy has said, around the tangible difference that those costs are coming out as, and seeking to have those redirected towards prevention.
So this case was covered last week by the news outlet Thunder Bay News Watch, and I'd like to read a quick quote from that article. It says, "The evacuation efforts are necessary because federal officials forced the community to relocate to a floodplain in 1957, and until a federal commitment to help the community move permanently to higher ground becomes a reality." So 1957 was a long time ago. How much longer do you suppose the community of Kashechewan will have to wait until there is a permanent solution in place so they don't have to evacuate every year?
Short answer, please.
I think those are longer-term discussions that continue with the community. Joanne, very quickly.
Very quickly, it is an active discussion with Kashechewan and Fort Albany First Nations around what the community's wishes and desires are in terms of a longer-term plan.
Thank you. Ms. Shanahan, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I thank all the witnesses for being here today. And I thank my colleague, Mr. Cram, for really sussing out that essential tension between are we continually in this catch-22 where we're throwing money at simply solving, emergency saving lives, or are we able to capture some of that money, do the right thing soon enough, capture some of that money, and then put it into prevention? And I do want to ask Mrs. Wilkinson, just what do you mean when prior to 2013 it was on a recovery basis only, emergency management? What does that mean?
So by recovery, I mean expenses that were made for communities to evacuate and then to be repatriated home. That was essentially the extent of the program. And following 2013, it was extended to cover the 4 pillars of emergency management. So prevention, mitigation, and those types of activities. So it became a broader program after that audit.
Excellent. So we're still in the early stages, I would say, of a completely new way of doing things. And as my colleagues know around the table, I'm very much a process and management person. So I'm intrigued by that because it's the frequency of events, and I think I heard one of the witnesses say that. It's the frequency of events that, of course, is capitulating us into a whole other level. That being said, I'm hearing progress. And one thing I do want to ask perhaps Ms. Wilson about, and then maybe to the Auditor General, that this government split Indigenous Affairs at one point, and I remember that was quite a shocking event. I don't know that happens very often, but it's, as we know, it's now Crown and Indigenous Relations and of course Indigenous Services, your department. So what effect did that have on kind of this transformational effect on how the department did things?
I wasn't there at the time, but I can only imagine it was highly disruptive. Valerie?
Thank you for the question. I mean, absolutely, I was there and learned about it in the Globe and Mail, just like others. I was at the First Nations Inuit Health Branch of Health Canada, and that is a really important factor in terms of Indigenous Services Canada, because that branch became part of Indigenous Services Canada along with other sectors of the former Indigenous Affairs. What that did is actually gave us an opportunity to include health emergencies within the Emergency Management Assistance Program scope. And in a post-pandemic, not quite post-pandemic, but in a COVID recovery type of time, it has been so essential for us to ensure that when we have emergency evacuations, we are thinking about mental health cultural supports. When we have health emergencies, we're thinking about infrastructure, and we're thinking about other aspects, right, of how to ensure that we're responding and also mitigating risk over time. So I would say in this space, this has been such an important transformation. The other aspect is that our mandate is different. Like the enabling legislation that has established Indigenous Services Canada is very different than the legislation that what the Indigenous Affairs was founded upon. And I would encourage all members to really look at that legislation because it speaks to the transformation of services towards self-determination of Indigenous peoples. And that includes health and other sectors of responsibility of this department.
Very encouraging. How much time do I have, Chair? Excellent, because that brings me to the point that has been made. The Auditor General made a very important point, and she has done so over a number of reports, that it is outcomes that are important, not outputs. My colleague, Mr. McCauley, made a remark earlier on, about performance pay and did these people deserve their bonuses and so on. I'd like to remind Mr. McCauley, and I know he knows because he sits on government operations, that performance pay is based on individual performance, HR, management, that kind of thing, where it's departmental results, which I know Mr. McCauley enjoys perusing regularly. It's departmental results that provide outcomes. So when we look at something, Auditor General Hogan, like the fact that we started out 2015, 2016 with 100 water advisories, and now we're down to, I believe, 31. Is that the kind of outcome we're looking for?
Well, I think in that respect, the report focused on long-term drinking water advisories, and the commitment to lift all of them had not been reached. But more broadly, the important statement there was that a long-term solution had not been reached. There are so many short-term drinking water advisories that fall just short of the year mark that are repeated over and over again. And until you've given capacity to communities to help manage their own water treatment plants, and you have found a long-term sustainable solution, lifting half of long-term drinking water advisories is progress, but not the outcome. Every Canadian deserves safe drinking water.
But progress is where we want to be. Thank you.
Thank you. And we now move to our third round, starting with Mr. McCauley for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And to address your comment, Ms. Shanahan, I don't think any spin you put on this can justify bonus payouts for such miserable results, period. And not a penny of it is justified. 817 of the AG's report talks about 112 infrastructure projects are identified but not funded due to insufficient funding. I have to say I find it extremely odd that this government has $150 million to pay Elon Musk to subsidize wealthy people to buy electric cars, but we have insufficient money for the infrastructure. I almost think that perhaps you should put a charging station as part of the infrastructure to get this government to react. How much cost in emergency relief is projected because of the underfunded and therefore not completed mitigation projects?
Sorry, if I could better understand the question you're asking.
I'll repeat. There's 112 infrastructure projects identified but not funded due to insufficient funding. How much in emergency relief costs is projected because of the underfunded, therefore not completed mitigation projects?
Like an extrapolation of that.
Has an analysis been done?
I don't know if there's actually been an analysis that's been done.
I will tell you, Article 6.5 in the 2013 report states that your department should be doing that, an analysis of what the costs are.
Would you like
an
analysis?
It just goes to and continue 9 years ago, and it's still not even being started. You talked about a lack of funding. Are you aware of any projects that have gone to the Treasury Board Secretariat for this infrastructure that has been turned down?
Individual projects do not go to Treasury Board specifically. We go to So
you've never had funding turned down by the Treasury Board for the infrastructure projects?
So Treasury Board actually would operate on the basis of a broader ask around infrastructure.
Have you ever had a broader ask around infrastructure that's been turned down or reduced by Treasury Board?
No.
Okay. I'm curious, how can we be saying in this department that we're underfunded, but the department's never been therefore turned down for funding requests by the Treasury Board?
The actual process, Madam Chair, is that you actually get policy approval of an initiative. Okay. And then Treasury Board...
Where's the problem? We know there's a lack of funding. We know the Treasury Board's never turned down any funding requests. Is it just a lack of political will to put a project together? Like you've stated that you don't have the funding and that you want more funding. Like who's not asking for it? Like what's the issue?
Well, sir, we are asking for it. It's not a matter of not asking for it. I'm not sure if you're clear on how...
Was I incorrect earlier when you said that you did not have enough funding or insufficient
I think
funding?
you're incorrect because you're actually asking what have we... the process is not being understood here, is what I'm saying.
There's 112 identified infrastructure projects that have not received funding. Why have they not received the
If you'd
funding?
like me to explain how the process works,
No, I'm not
I'd be
asking
happy
the
to
process.
do so.
I'm asking there's
because
112
the question doesn't align with the
projects.
process.
Ms. Wilson, 112 identified projects that have not received funding. Have we asked, has the department asked for the funding for those?
We do not go to Treasury Board with every individual project. That is not how the process works.
Has the dollar amount been put together in a bucket, so to speak, and put forward for funding? Like, how are we
Yes.
not getting the funding?
Yes, in fact, we are putting those numbers together for an actual fulsome costing of all infrastructure projects.
Of those 100, what's the funding cost for those 112 outstanding
We don't have the
ones?
details of that yet. We're just calculating those. We will be issuing what we heard report on infrastructure consultation.
How old are those 112 projects?
How
Are
old
they,
are they? I don't have the details of how.
New, several years old, like we see with some of the other issues?
I would ask Joanne and Kenza if they know the details of every 112 projects.
Would you be able to get back to us in the committee? Is it?
It's
Okay.
in there?
Actually,
Okay,
it's
great. It's in there.
Okay. Okay. 834 talks about the incredible amount, again, of mitigation projects waiting for funding eligibility. I guess some of these have been known since 2013. I'm going to quote the AG, as a result, communities are likely to continue to experience emergencies that could be prevented or mitigated by building the infrastructure. Like, again, I have to go back, like, what is the cost of not funding this infrastructure? I think it was identified we're paying $3 for cleanup or repair for every dollar we could have been spending on mitigation to prevent this. 9 years ago, the AG at the time suggested, we should be performing this analysis. Like, do we know how much we're going to be spending because we haven't been doing these infrastructure projects?
The answer will have to wait for the next round.
Okay,
Thank you. And we move on to Mr. Gahir for 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for making time for the committee. My questions are for Indigenous Services Canada and to the Deputy Minister in particular. So the OAG noted that the department had done a great gender-based analysis plus, which revealed that Indigenous elders, women, and youth were more likely to be negatively affected by emergencies. I'm not entirely aware that the department factors these considerations in when planning for emergency services. So I'm just wondering, how does the department plan to incorporate its gender-based analysis plus into its emergency services planning?
Sure, I can do this. I'm actually the GBA Plus champion for Indigenous Services Canada, so thank you so much for the question. So we have a community of practice within the department of all sectors, have focal points specific to GBA Plus. We also have a core team of individuals that have the strong expertise to be able to support the guidance in terms of the analysis. So every time that we do either a budget submission, a Treasury Board submission, our departmental results report, any aspect of our reporting, we ensure that there is an intersectional analysis that is conducted with respect to the level of risk and what we are doing specifically in terms of mitigation. That would include also any policy submission to Cabinet.
Great, thank you. To the Deputy Minister, so I'm new to this committee, just subbing in. I noticed that you're from and you got your professional career started in an Indigenous community. How has your upbringing and connection to the land influenced your view in emergency management and the need for that transformation?
I wasn't expecting that question, but it should be an easy one to answer. So yes, I grew up in Gittigan-Zibi First Nation, lived there, went to school there. And I would say lived experience for actually both Valerie and I is very much part of the work that we do. And so I worked in the community for many years. I worked on community development initiatives, crisis shelter, addictions treatment center. I ran the health and social services program in Gittigan-Zibi. And I certainly learned a lot. My hat is off to all people that work in community because it is the toughest job I've ever had. Thank you for the question.
No, thank you for the answer. What are some of the recent successes that the department has had in advancing emergency management services? And do you have a number of how much money has been spent in the last 10 years or so on this particular issue?
So you broke up there for a moment, but I believe you're looking for some expenditure results, but maybe I'll ask Joanne or Kenza if they want to take that.
So maybe just in terms of success stories, I think we've spoken about Kasheshwan and the On the Land initiative. That has certainly been one of them. I think the work that we are also doing in terms of multilateral agreements is critical in terms of having First Nations as full and equal partners around emergency management tables. We've also done a great amount of work in British Columbia, for example, where we've provided a significant amount of funding to the First Nations Emergency Services Society. Those are First Nation partners who are actively working on the ground to deliver emergency services, including Fire Smart and a number of other prevention projects. We've also done a great deal of non-structural mitigation, so outside of the infrastructure area, and we can certainly get back to the question, the previous question around costs of those projects, but non-structural mitigation includes everything from capacity development, the emergency coordinators that we've spoken of, on the ground things like radio systems, connection to provincial systems that are required for the safe evacuation of folks. So lots happening on that front. We met just this week with Peguis First Nation, which is a First Nation also that is continually at risk. We have there provided a number of advance payments. So rather than waiting for all of the claims to come in, I referred earlier to recovery-based. That's what recovery-based means in terms of the financial aspect. We get the claims in, we pay the claims out for those eligible expenses. We're now trying to move increasingly to providing advance payments to nations like Peguis so that they're not put at risk themselves from a financial perspective. So we take on that risk. We work with them in terms of determining the eligibility of their claims, but that it lessens the financial risk for them having put out that money in the first place. So I would leave it there. I don't want to use up all of your time. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. So my final question is for the Deputy Minister. I find that a report sometimes can leave out certain nuances. Is there anything that you want to add in that's not quite captured in the report itself?
A very short answer.
Just want to recognize all the emergency management professionals from every province, territory, federally, and in First Nation communities for all the hard work that they're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we now move on to Madame Sinclair Degany for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. And we'd just like to point out that the answers to the questions put by Mr. colleague, Mr. Macaulay, are in the Auditor General's report, so it seems surprising that you don't have them. We can read that the estimated cost was $200 and some million for the 11 projects, but this is an underestimate given that some projects had no cost associated to them. If you go to the Treasury Board, I suggest that you improve the quality of these figures. That said, what we do see, and going back to my prior question right now, the infrastructure fund is $12 million a year. That's its current funding, so it would take 24 years for the department to fund all its projects. So what do you intend to do? We can't take 24 years, and there are more and more emergencies. We're now at 94 projects. The total cost is $358 million. That's our evaluations, and we are, of course, continuing to receive more detailed information about each project to better understand the needs, and this will evolve over time. Something to keep in mind that I mentioned earlier is that with the growing number of emergencies on a yearly basis and thus greater costs for recovery and so on, we will need to continue to shift our estimates given how quickly things are changing. And of course, the costs may go up, labor may go up, which we certainly hope, given that inflation is very high, and we certainly hope that salaries will keep pace with it. When it comes to the calendar that I have been calling for, you mentioned that you will draw up an action plan. Could you undertake to ensure that it include a clear calendar for responding to the Auditor General's requests and recommendations? I appreciate that suggestion.
Je vais vous reposer la question si...
I'll put the question again. If we don't see a calendar, I assure you that I will provide further encouragement. Another question about communities that had problems. 4 of the 13 hadn't presented any funding requests. Why not? Why were you in touch with them? How can you explain that some of the communities that were worst hit were not contacted and asked to fill in funding requests? I wouldn't say that we didn't communicate with them. I think it's a matter of the fact that they didn't submit applications, as Joanne has mentioned. already, we will continue to remain proactive, reform, capacity building in communities, and ensuring that there are emergency management coordinators and having that part of their role as well.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I recognize that there's short time, so I'd like to offer some quick questions and hoping for some quick responses. In relation to the First Nations Infrastructure Fund, which I understand the department has until March 2024 to, under that dedicated stream, has an annual budget of $12 million to fund structural mitigation projects. Short of understanding, short of what Mr. McCauley was saying in relation to the Treasury Board, is that enough funding to actually ensure that projects that are requested on behalf of the ministry are funded?
Joanne, can you explain the First Nation Infrastructure Program and some of the details there?
Certainly. So you are correct. The funding that we have available for specifically for structural mitigation is $12 million a year. We spend 100% of that funding, and as Associate Deputy Minister Gideon mentioned, the costs that we have estimated currently for the 94 unfunded structural mitigation project proposals is $358 million. We certainly do seek to leverage investment opportunities from not only internal to ISK, but with other partners. The Deputy mentioned Infrastructure Canada. We work with all partners who can bring those types of funding proposals forward, and certainly within our own operation, as we work with nations and as they prioritize their infrastructure needs, we work with them to align those resources as best we can, depending on the priorities of the First Nation. Thank you.
So let me be clear. It was said that there was funding capacity issues. You're saying that there's a need of $358 million. The question that's important and relates to my first question was in relation to accountability. So if it's not Treasury Board, are you making the request for finances to actually achieve this target to the minister?
Yes.
Has the minister responded to your request for increased finances?
Very supportive.
And do you believe that there will be an increase beyond $12 million to this fund?
It is up to Parliament to appropriate those dollars to us. We'll gladly take them.
Do you think it would be anywhere near the actual need, $358 million?
I can't say.
Not sure?
I don't know what those decisions.
How much did you request of the minister?
No, I'm not going to go there.
You don't know how much you requested of the minister?
Your
assistant deputy minister said there was $358 million in need requested to your minister on behalf of First Nations partners. You also said that First Nations partnerships are really important to the ministry and that you act on behalf of those requests. Of the $358 million, did you request that amount from the minister?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll move on to Mr. Vidal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to follow up. I'm going to throw my accountant's hat back on for a little while here. This is kind of fun. I don't get to do that very often at INAN. So I'm going to go back to this projects thing because I think we need to drill into that a little bit further. In the report on page 9, it talks about at April 22nd, April of 2022, that there was a $291 million funding gap. And now Ms. Gideon just talked about that number now being identified as $358 million, I think I'm comparing the numbers correctly. According to Public Safety Canada, in their 2019 Emergency Management Strategy for Canada, for every $1 invested in preparedness and mitigation, $6 could be saved in emergency response and recovery. So some simple math on the back of a napkin here. If we actually invested in these 112 projects or whatever that number's up to in projects now since April of 2022, that would create $2,148 million that would be available to invest in other areas. That could be housing, that could be schools, that could be mental health, that could be. It seems like a pretty good return on investment to me. Does that make sense that we would let's get up front and get ahead of this and keep $2 billion in the coffers to invest in other things? Does that make sense to you?
It makes sense, and I'm open to all suggestions around alternative modes of financing and calculations, but I will reread your transcript very closely, so I make sure I understand the math that you're putting forward, and I will discuss it with the team. So it makes at first blush it makes a lot of sense.
It's simply 358 million times 6 based on the Auditor General's numbers in the report. So that's not hard, I don't think. So you talked about needing more resources. You talked about I'm going there. There's a source of resources. There's $2 billion, right? So let's consider that. You talked about, and sorry, I'm talking or directing this to you, Deputy Minister. Now, sorry, you talked about actively pursuing agreements with communities or these multilateral agreements. But yet, in the Auditor General's report, it says that in Budget 2019, there's $1.4 million that was directed over 3 years to invest in these multilateral agreements, and yet at April 2022, no agreements had been signed. In your opening comments, you actually talked about one. And sorry, I get everybody likes to play the language games, but you talked about a tripartite, but it's a memo of understanding. So I've been around long enough that there's a difference between a memo of understanding and agreement. I've been around Northern Saskatchewan, and I've been to, with my mayor's hat on, have been to many memo of understanding signings. And so $790,000 of that $1.4 million has been invested in this pursuit of agreements. Like what did we spend the $790,000 on if we have 0 agreements to date? Do we spend $790,000 on one memo of understanding?
I think, regardless, again, if an agreement is put in place or not, there is active work going on to build capacity as part of those negotiations. For instance, a lot of emphasis is put on emergency management plans as the outcome documents that are signed, but make no mistake, we want them too. But there bears a lot of value as well when First Nation communities are part of that planning. The process of developing them is just as important as the outcome.
Fair enough. I totally get that. So is there a number of agreements that we have that are just really close to being signed then? Like we've spent more than half our money on this project, or are we going to come back and say, well, we need another few $1 million to are we close on any then at least? Because we have 0 signed. Are we close on any?
Without giving away other parties and the sense of negotiations and where we're at, I know, for instance, that I'm actively involved in discussions with British Columbia and in discussions with Ontario. So that says to me that we're closer if I'm directly involved.
Thank you. I'm going to get one more quick question in here before the chair cuts me off. You commented about even if there was an agreement, we would still work with communities. That we would, and fair enough. I get that, but I would suggest to you that if you're working with communities, you're working with provincial people, you're working with municipal governments and First Nations and the federal government, that if you don't have an agreement in place, I think we're reactive, not proactive. I think we're going to be very slow to react to an emergency if we have to start all of a sudden pulling that all together. And I would argue that's a much slower way to get the work done. And I'm sorry, please prove me wrong if you have a response to that would prove me wrong.
I want to be very clear, though, if I have time on this point, because
Short answer,
regardless of an agreement being put in place, bilateral, multilateral, First Nation, all First Nation communities will continue and have been receiving the help they need to protect their people and infrastructure during an emergency. So PTs, provinces, territories continue to protect all citizens in their areas. And so I just wanted to make sure that was very, very clear, that because an agreement is not in place, it does not mean that the services are not there for particularly response.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson, and we'll move to Ms. Bradford for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it's been a very impassioned session this afternoon, and I think it's because we all realize the seriousness of the situation and our frustration with the chronic lack of progress. But I think all of us around the table, all parties and those of us virtually, we really want to see substantial progress made, and it's because we care so much about this community. So I'm looking again at the Saskatchewan situation, and I wanted to follow along Mr. Crumb's line of questioning. So this poor community has gone through evacuations, some precautions after they've been flooded over and over and over again, and we can only imagine how disruptive that is. And so now you've got the situation where you temporarily move them to higher ground onto their traditional lands. Like, we know the definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So why is this only temporary? Is there any consultation with the community to see, would you like to permanently be relocated on your traditional lands? that are higher elevation, so you could maybe get through a year without being disrupted and uprooted.
Joanne?
That's a discussion that is led by the First Nation because it's a decision that the First Nation would need to make. We would never impose that on a nation, but it's a very active discussion, has been a very active discussion in that community for many years. And I would say I wouldn't qualify it as temporary necessarily. The 2 years of on the land initiatives, that has been something that the community has requested. If they request it again this year, and if the risk continues to be high, then we would absolutely support them in undertaking that initiative. Thank you.
Do you have any sense of how they might be trying to come together as a community to reach a decision? Are they thinking of doing a referendum on it, or like you said, they've been debating it for many years. So I agree, it's their decision, but you think, maybe they might want to make a decision so they could move forward.
We've certainly supported them in terms of providing space and time for them to have some of those discussions. We've had, provided assistance to them in terms of some of the research that they might want to undertake or those types of activities. But again, it really is for the First Nation to determine.
I agree. I know these things are really hard. It's just unfortunate to see them go through that same disruption over and over and over again. I've had a few flooded basements in my life, and that's minor compared to this. So now, what resources could help regional offices to assist them to establish or upgrade their regional plans? Who could answer that for us? Would that be the Deputy Minister?
We do have many regional plans in place. If you're referring to the plans and not the agreements, Joanne, I'll turn to you again. Your regional operations, and you know the region, so you'll probably better answer than I.
So absolutely. So we are working actively with our regional offices, and as Associate Deputy Minister Gideon mentioned, with the new Indigenous Services Department, because we have brought the health organization and the former Indian and Northern Affairs offices into kind of one active discussion together. We are working to ensure that those plans are integrated from those organizations, that there is collaboration, that we have, introducing some standard templates, those types of things, to make sure that we have the information that's required to ensure that they have the resources and they're able to support communities. Thank you.
Okay. Now, would you say that the work of the OAG report aligns with the work already underway at the ISC? And could you provide us with some of the examples? Again, getting back to Ms. Wilson on that.
Yes, I would say, and actually did refer to that in opening remarks, that I do believe that the 7 recommendations do align with a lot of the work that we are undertaking. So I actually find it quite helpful, particularly in the area of risk. I believe we have a better understanding of what the Auditor General is holding us to when it comes to a comprehensive, detailed risk register. And so when we have these conversations, and the Auditor General is very open in terms of going back and forth and talking to us and giving us some understanding of what the expectations are, I certainly have found that very helpful.
So are the 7 recommendations ranked in order of importance, or is it just random, or are all 7 equally important in your opinion?
Obviously, we think that all 7 should be implemented. The time frame and what alignment works best for the department is up to the Deputy Minister, but all should be addressed, absolutely.
Okay. And again, getting back to Ms. Wilson, was there anything that you would have liked to have seen in the report that you feel should be there that wasn't covered, or?
Well, I would think that, for instance, the focus on First Nation voices as full and equal partners, as well as other services providers, and that to be very clear that ISK is not the sole service provider for emergency management services. And I'm not to criticize the report, but I'm not sure if that comes across very clearly, that we do not do direct delivery. And the rationale behind that it kind of implies that we should be the delivery agent, and I would advise that that would not be a good way to go, and probably not acceptable to First Nations who want to be self-determining in that respect.
Thank you. And we move now to Mr. Cram for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again to the witnesses for being here. I would like to follow up on the Kashechewan First Nation. So the Auditor General's report was covered in the news outlet tbnewswatch.com last week, and the title of the article is Haidu Accepts Conclusions of AG Report on First Nations Emergency Management. And in the article, it implies, or it says rather, and until a federal commitment to help the community move permanently to higher ground becomes a reality. And so the article implies that the First Nation is waiting on a federal commitment to relocate them. So can the witnesses elaborate? Have you received an application from the Kashechewan First Nation?
No, we haven't, and I'll turn back to Joanne. To respond, but I just would say that it's a very complex situation for both Kashechewan and Fort Albany First Nations in terms of making this really, really important decision.
Absolutely. And so, as I said, it has been an ongoing discussion among community members and with us over a number of years. And certainly there was a previous comment that, one would think that there would be community ratification. They have done that before in terms of, looking at what the options are. There is not unanimity, I would say, in terms of kind of what the longer term goal would be. And of course, relocating an entire community the size of Kashechewan is not a quick, simple, or inexpensive proposition. So in terms of, looking at what planning would be necessary, should that be the community's, confirmed desire to move to higher ground, if they made that decision, there would need to be a significant planning. There would need to be a significant funding envelope identified that does not currently exist for that type of relocation. But certainly it's, as I said before, it is the lead of the First Nation to determine their desire in that space. Thank you.
Okay, but we just freed up $8 million a year 2 years ago for a community of 1,800 persons. Like, where are these complexities? Like, what's the holdup? To me, that seems like a pretty straightforward thing to do, to just relocate them to the same grounds that they are relocated to every year already. What seems to be the holdup?
Well, I would say that the evacuation is not to a fully developed community. So the community of Kashechewan has infrastructure, schools, housing, those types of things. The evacuation to higher land is to a camp we bring in. We've funded the tent, not tents in the sense of kind of a camping tent, but hard-walled tents and infrastructure that is temporary and that is usable for spring. But it is not a permanent encampment sort of piece that we have developed up there. It's not another community that they've gone to evacuate to, like they would into a community like Thunder Bay, for example. So it is a temporary place for them to evacuate to for a specified amount of time. It's not a new community. So if they were to relocate permanently, that's part of the planning that would have to take place around the broader infrastructure, water treatment plants, schools, health services, all those types of things, which don't exist permanently on the land that is used for the back to the land evacuation. Thanks.
When was the last time anyone from the department talked with the Kashechewan First Nation about their plans?
I know that there have been ongoing discussions. I don't have a date for you, but we could certainly come back to you with a date. I would say it would be within the last few months.
Yes, if you could provide that date for the committee, that would be helpful. And can you walk the committee through what would the process be in terms of relocating to higher ground? Like, do you have to fill out a form? Do you have to fill out, a lengthy form? It seems like it should be simpler for a community of 1,800 persons that was forcibly relocated 65 years ago.
There's no form, there's no application or proposal or process. This happens very, very infrequently, and I would say it is extremely complex to do because, first of all, as Joanne said, the community needs to make a decision, and you have different views within the community where to go, if they go, when they go, how they go. So all of these elements need to be determined within the community, and I would say that our role would be to support that process, to be part of the research, like as Joanne said, funding research, whatever is required. I think that has been the role of Indigenous Services when it's come to, and CERNAC would be involved in that too, because there would be land issues and so on. So all that to say, it's not an application, it's not an easy process, it's an extremely complex one.
Thank you, and we now move to Ms. Shanahan for 5 minutes.
Very good. And Chair, I just wanted to, I was trying to catch my colleague, Mr. Desjardins' eye, but if he would like to share my time for 2.5 minutes, because yes, this is a very important subject, and I think we all want to see progress. And I am hearing some very good things in this room today, and that is that there seems to be all-party support that there needs to be more investment in this issue, because nobody wants to be penny wise and pound foolish, if I can use that old saying, right? The money's got to be put up front, and we'll reap the benefits later on. Deputy Minister, I think it was you who, in answer to a question just before, was talking about nobody wants to see ESEC, I guess that's how you say it, as the delivery agent. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Or maybe that was...
I guess one of the things Valerie Gideon mentioned was that Indigenous Services Canada is working hard towards service transfer, which means First Nations running many of the services, programs, and operations that we currently undertake. Gone are the days where ISK will go into communities and deliver programs and services. Those days have way gone past, and First Nations would not appreciate that whatsoever. First Nations who want to move to self-determination and take on the control, but they want to be able to take on programs that are working, programs that are funded well, programs that will actually make a difference. So the rationale really that we should be the sole delivery agent it would just not be acceptable. On that basis, I would say that First Nations are actively working with us in all parts of the country to look at taking on services and programs, to look at new funding agreements that offer them more flexibility. I think the work is very slow moving. I personally, I would love to see things move a lot more quicker, but we move at a pace that is a pace that's comfortable for First Nations, and so that's where we're at.
Well, that is good to hear. And time over now to
yes.
Mr. Desjardins. Thank you very much.
What's the remaining time? Sorry.
2 minutes and 35 seconds. Sorry, and then we'll add on your 2.5.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Shanahan, for allowing me some additional time. And I do want to thank all the members of the committee for what I think is very excellent questions. And I think this is the kind of allyship many people expect across the country for what I think is really important work. So thank you for that. Just wanted to pick up from the Deputy Minister's last comment, which I sympathize with. If we had infinite resources in this country, it would be my hope that we would address these issues. The issue is that we do, in fact, have enough resources, but may not have the political will. That's the tough part that I can't grapple with. You mentioned time. And so with the existing First Nations Infrastructure Fund annual budget, which is the $12 million, just given the existing amount of projects that are currently being asked of the department to fund, it would take approximately 24 years for the department to fund all of the existing projects that you've reviewed. Just existing, not even counting the ones that are not even reviewed yet, which my province, unfortunately, of Alberta, takes the highest account for. We point to figure in Exhibit 8.4. Albertan First Nations are getting projects submitted to the ministry for years and years of years and are not even being reviewed. Not even being touched. It says these are unreviewed applications and proposals under the fund. And so if we even accounted for any of the unreviewed ones, we'd be seeing a wait time of 30 years. So under the existing funding formula of the First Nations Infrastructure Program, it would take over quarter decade to just make sure that the existing projects that are being requested and reviewed would be funded. This is simply unacceptable. 25 years from now, we're talking near 2050, when we would hopefully see more work towards climate adaptation. Unfortunately, we're seeing this is not the kind of fund that is equipped to deal with the actual emergencies that are facing First Nations. Not certainly in my province, where more than half of the applications go unreviewed every single day. And there seems to be a continued failure to actually make sure that there's a comprehensive plan that my colleague, Ms. Sinclair Deganay, mentioned. It's imperative that we actually have full measurables. And so I also would like to ask more specifically in relation to the actual fund itself. When this fund and your work to advocate, let's call it, with the minister, it's important for members of parliament like the members who are assembled today to know that when a ministry requests funding, that the parliamentarians know about it so that we can actually ensure that you get that funding. Having the minister, and solely the minister, responsible for declining these applications is simply unacceptable in Canada. And to the Auditor General's point of accountability, this is a tool that this committee needs. And I think we got that today, which I was very pleased to hear the Deputy Minister make mention about the fact that she had advocated for, at the very least, $358 million of the existing First Nations proposals that one of her colleagues had mentioned, with the minister directly. And so we know that fact, and that's an important fact for parliamentarians to recognize that on the record, the Deputy Minister has in fact quoted that she has asked the minister for $358 million to ensure that these projects are fully funded, excluding the ones that are unreviewed. Should we actually see accountability from this, I really do need to ask this question, will that even be enough to ensure that the existing projects are funded and the projects that are still awaiting review? Is that sufficient for that?
I want to contextualize my answer by indicating that the First Nation Infrastructure Fund, the capital facilities management program we have, funds infrastructure broadly: housing, school renos, water treatment plants, structural mitigation projects.
Clean water,
dikes,
for example.
Dikes, roads, bridges, etc. And what we need to do as part of our program and part of our operations is to work with First Nation communities at the regional level or at the local level in order to make priority decisions of allocations for their communities. Sometimes there isn't enough resources, I would say, to fund all of those projects at this point in time. If parliamentarians were going to allocate those resources to us, we would be able to definitely fund more projects.
What's that number? What kind of much money do you need from the parliamentarians? You mentioned that you need money from parliamentarians. How much can we give you?
This will come through the regular process of appropriating dollars to us, and I'm given a time limit here to answer. So I don't.
We just need the number.
I can't come to you with a proposal, sir. I need to be able to go through the regular process.
Is it at least more than 12 million? That's what you have now.
The amount of overall infrastructure dollars we would be seeking is definitely more than 12 million.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good for me. Time? How much time do we have? Oh, well, thank you very much for that response, and thank you to my colleagues.
Okay, and now we move to Ms. Sinclair Deganay, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for having accepted to give my colleague, Mr. Desjardins, a bit more time. Now, Auditor General, the 112 projects that are waiting, how many people are involved? I'm sorry, I don't have all those details. But is that information available when you carry out your audit? No, it wasn't available, so it didn't include it. When you went to ISC, they didn't have information about, let's say, a project, how many people would be helped by that project. That wasn't clear. I'm looking at my colleague who looked into the details, and he's telling me that no. Isn't that too a problem, not knowing how many people would benefit from a project? Madam.
We focused on the actual projects that were listed as opposed to how many individuals were impacted by each of those projects. That's not the way that the data is laid out. So that information was not available in the data.
Pourtant, il s'agit d'un audit de performance, on est d'accord.
It's a performance audit, right? So yes, I imagine it would be easy to figure that out. How many communities in the people in the community, that's how we do it. But if it's like 5 houses, we would have to know, does this benefit only those living in the houses or the entire community? So we didn't try to decide such figures. It was just important for us to show that many projects had not yet been evaluated or funded. It would be important for us to know for our work how many people would be assisted, because we're also concerned about efficiency. You know, $358 million. Will we be helping, a good number of people? Is it enough money, a lot of money, not much money, given the number of people, and so on and so forth? That's something that would help us. May I offer that setting up projects to help a community help all the people in the community, of course, and future generations of that community. So I'm not sure that it's the sort of number that would be really helpful in this discussion. The idea is to understand what the effect for the community would be and into the future. So some communities are large communities, some are small communities. Yes, but a 1,000-person community might be in an area with a lot of flooding, and perhaps they should be helped first, even if it's a small community. And that risk assessment has to come into account as well. That's what we would like to see. May I finish my sentence? The second issue would be useful. I'd like to see it in the action plan, a prioritization of the plans. Of course, if it's an emergency situation, it should go first. I understand that.
To Mr. Vidal for 5 minutes, please.
Me to
Go
go?
ahead.
You, right?
Yeah, I can go ahead.
Okay, so Mr.
I'm also going to claim the 2 seconds from Mr.
Okay.
Desiree.
No, that's fine.
I thought I was done, so I'm going to just come back to a couple other questions.
Oh, you're going to go? Okay,
so,
go ahead.
So Mr. Vidal, you will be going and not Mr. Kelly?
Sure. Sure, I will.
Okay, all right, we'll start now then.
I'm gonna go back to where I started in the very beginning, and some comments around the quote from the minister in the House the other day, and I was wanting to get back to Auditor General Hogan and then also to the Deputy Minister on just a couple thoughts out of that quote. The second part of the quote that we never got to in my first round was the end of that says we need to invest more in protection and adaptation. And I just, for clarity, want to get the Auditor General's opinion on, in fact, are we saying we need to invest more money or we need to direct our investments in better ways? There's a clear distinction there between redirecting resources to the right places rather than adding new resources.
So I'm not sure I understand what the minister meant when he made that statement, but I guess my observation would be that in a world where there are limited resources to be invested, being able to prioritize those most in need would be the first. When there is more resources available, then addressing all issues absolutely would be the ultimate goal, but you really do need to prioritize those most in need first.
Fair enough. And I mean, when we take some of the statistics or some of the facts that you include in your report, for example, the 3 to 3.5 to 1 or the 1 to 6, and I think you know what I mean in the context of those numbers. You're very familiar with those. I think, and the number I talked to before about freeing up almost $2 billion that we could redirect somewhere else. So I don't think it's always about more money. I think it's about money being better spent in the right places where we can get better return and better, we talked about outcomes and results, and I guess that's kind of where I was going with that.
I'm absolutely in full agreement with you. Money is not the solution to every problem, but money does help build mitigation measures here to help reduce the potential spend on recovery side. And I appreciated your calculation. I guess the only one I would offer up, caveat I'd offer up to that calculation is it's up to $6. Not every dollar invested will result in a straight $6. So, but the point and the spirit behind your calculation, I endorse.
Put the money in the right places.
Put the money in the right places to those who need it the most, yeah.
And sorry, that circles all the way back to the risk-based assessments and risk-based strategies, right, rather than proposal-based. I think we need to, I always joke that in my vast experience in being on these files in 3 whole years now, one of the frustrations is that we get stuck in these here's how we do it boxes, and we don't think outside the boxes. We don't think of new and different ways, and I think there's some and part of that is the systems. Part of that is the systems we create within our bureaucracy, where we create spaces for people where they have to be safe. They can't make decisions outside of it's and I get that in large organizations. I mean, that's not even necessarily a criticism, but an observation. I want to come back for a second to the context of how we spending the money in the right places. And I'm going to go back to, there was a PBO report that was actually released on, I think it was May 18th of 2022. And it talked a lot about the increase in spending in both ISC and CERNAC from 2015-16 all the way to 2022. And it compared those to the results that were recorded in all the departmental results. And it did an analysis of all that. And I would look for your comment to this conclusion. It says the analysis indicated or concluded that increased spending did not result in a commensurate improvement in the ability of these organizations to achieve the goals that they had set for themselves. It goes on with a little bit of explanation about kind of how some of the results get moved around and some of that are the targets and whatever. But in the very end, it says, you know what? We did not achieve these commensurate improvements based on that. I said that. In fact, it says, based on a qualitative review, the ability to achieve targets specified has declined. And so if you go further into the report, it talks about spending increasing by 115% over those years, but the results achieved. So, my colleague, Mr. McCauley, was talking about kind of the challenge of people being held to account for, their performance bonus, and that, the comeback was that, well, that doesn't necessarily impact department results because it's personal goals and personal things. But if none of that is connected, if we don't connect the personal outcomes to the departmental results, where's the incentive to get it done? Where's the incentive to get the job done when it's personal results, not corporate results? We need to get outcomes, and maybe Deputy Minister, I'll let you respond to that in the context of in your department, would you agree that we need to find a way to make sure that we're getting better results by whatever the processes we include in your department are?
A short answer, please.
Short answer, I agree. I'm an optimist, and I believe in continuous improvement. I believe in working smarter. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the witnesses for coming and answering questions on an emotional and challenging issue. So thank you for that. And also the committee for all your great questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, yes, and I'd like to thank the clerk, our translators, our analysts. So is the committee in agreement to adjourn the meeting? Yes. Meeting adjourned.